Everyone knows the French Revolution is a story of liberty, equality, and rebellion against tyranny. But few realize it began with numbers, not ideals. It wasn't the storming of the Bastille that broke France. It was the storming of its balance sheet. The guillotines came later. The debt came first. Beneath the slogans and blood, the real cause was simple. The state went broke. France didn't fall because of kings or queens, but because it ran out of credit. What happens when a government can no longer borrow, print, or tax enough to survive? History answers with one word: revolution. Before we go deeper, let's make this interactive. I want to know, from which country are you watching this, and what time is it where you are right now? Drop your answer in the comments. It helps me understand how far this story travels, because what happened in France could happen anywhere. And if you're learning something new already, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm you care about real history, not the simplified version from school. Now, let's rewind to France in the 1700s. The country was rich in culture, art, and influence. Paris was the beating heart of Europe. But under the surface, its economy was collapsing. The royal treasury was running on fumes, drained by decades of war and luxury. King Louis XIV had spent fortunes on the Palace of Versailles and endless conflicts. His successors inherited not wealth, but debt. By 1780, France owed more than 4 billion livres, a number impossible to repay with its fragile tax base. The interest alone swallowed half the annual budget. The deeper problem was structure. France's tax system was rigged from the top down. The richest, the clergy and nobilities, paid almost nothing. The poor paid everything. Imagine if your government charged small businesses 80% in taxes while billionaires got exemptions. That was France in 1788. The system crushed farmers, merchants, and workers, yet protected the elite who owned land and lent money to the crown. Every reform attempt failed because those same elites controlled the parliaments. But debt doesn't wait for politics. It compounds. And France's creditors wanted payment in gold, not excuses. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, had drained the treasury. Then came the American Revolution. France spent over 1.3 billion livres to help America defeat Britain, a move meant to weaken an enemy, but it destroyed its own finances instead. Soldiers returned home heroes, but the state returned bankrupt. When Jacques Necker, the finance minister, presented the royal accounts, he did something radical. He published them. Ordinary people saw for the first time how deep the hole was. Instead of building trust, it sparked outrage. If France was rich, why were bread prices rising? If the king was wise, why were farmers starving? The publication turned finance into politics, and politics into anger. In 1788, the crown did what every modern government does in crisis. It tried to borrow more. But Europe's lenders had lost faith. France's bonds fell. Interest rates spiked. The government could not raise fresh credit. The tax base was exhausted. Inflation crept higher. Then nature joined the revolt. A series of bad harvests sent grain prices soaring. Bread, the core of French diets, tripled in price. People starved while aristocrats held feasts. Every empire learns the same lesson. When the cost of food rises faster than wages, revolutions begin. Paris boiled over. But before mobs filled the streets, the failure began in offices and ledgers. Economists call it a liquidity trap. Historians call it the breaking point. In France, it started with a single decision: refusing to tax the rich. By 1789, Louis XV was out of moves. His advisors told him to call the Estates General, a national assembly that hadn't met in 175 years. The hope was negotiation. The result was mutiny. Representatives from the Third Estate, everyone outside the nobility and clergy, refused to be ignored. They declared themselves the true government, the National Assembly. But notice what triggered it. Insolvency, not freedom, not democracy, debt. When a system built on privilege faces financial collapse, it turns on itself. The crown could not pay soldiers, fund pensions, or buy grain. Its promises became worthless. Paper notes, called assignats, were issued against confiscated church land. It was an early version of quantitative easing, printing wealth from future hope. At first, it worked. Then, as printing expanded, trust evaporated. The assignats lost value, prices rose, and soon, no one wanted royal paper. This is where economics and emotion merged. Hunger made people desperate. Inflation made them furious. And injustice gave them a reason. When crowds stormed the Bastille in July 1789, they weren't thinking about tax policy, but the collapse that made it inevitable had already begun. France was no longer a functioning economy. It was a pyramid of IOUs built on privilege, waiting for gravity. If you think this is just history, remember, the pattern repeats. A government spends more than it earns. It borrows to bridge the gap. It promises reforms, but delays them. Eventually, debt service consumes everything else. Then come shortages, price shocks, and unrest. Every empire that forgets fiscal limits faces this test. The French Revolution was not spontaneous. It was arithmetic. The numbers broke before the people did. And when you look closer, you see familiar forces: unequal taxation, reckless spending, central banking experiments, and currency debasement disguised as innovation. We're not done yet. Because in the next part, we'll explore how this financial collapse gave birth to a new idea, that money itself could be political. France tried to fix its debt problem by reinventing value, and in the process, built one of history's earliest fiat systems. But it came at a cost: hyperinflation, distrust, and the death of an old order. Stay tuned, because what happens next shows how revolutions done to just destroy governments. They rewrite what money means. When the monarchy collapsed under its debts, the revolutionaries inherited more than power. They inherited a broken economy. The treasury was empty, credit was frozen, and gold had fled the country. France could not tax fast enough to feed its armies or pay for bread. So the new government turned to a radical experiment, creating money out of land. They seized properties from the church and the nobility, over 6 million hectares of some of the best land in Europe. On paper, this was wealth. In practice, it was a liquid. You can't use farmland to buy grain in Paris, so they created a bridge, paper notes called assignats. Backed by that confiscated land, each note represented a slice of future value. It was a clever fix at first. The idea was simple: issue notes, sell the land, and use proceeds to pay debt. It made sense in theory, but in execution, it unlocked a financial spiral. At first, the assignats worked. They circulated widely, people trusted them, and trade resumed. Farmers sold grain, workers got paid, the markets breathed again. But once a paper system starts, it's hard to stop. The government found itself printing more to cover every new expense. Armies needed pay, the poor needed bread, cities needed supplies. Soon, assignats were no longer linked to land. They became promises built on promises. By 1793, over 8 billion livres worth of assignats flooded the economy. Prices exploded. Bread that cost 4 sous now cost 12. A pair of shoes, once a week's wages, cost a month's pay. Inflation punished savers, rewarded speculators, and shattered trust. Markets became chaotic. Merchants hoarded goods. Farmers refused to sell grain for paper. The black market thrived. And ordinary citizens, who believed they'd been freed from royal exploitation, found themselves crushed by a new invisible tax: inflation. Economists later called it the revolutionary inflation. But to those living it, it was survival. The National Convention tried to fight it with laws. They fixed prices, banned hoarding, and declared economic enemies traitors. Guillotines rolled for bakers accused of raising prices. But policy can't override scarcity. The more they printed, the faster value disappeared. Here's where the story turns ironic. The same revolution that overthrew a king for fiscal mismanagement repeated the same mistakes. They thought political purity could defeat mathematics. They were wrong. You can't legislate trust. Once the public believes money is worthless, no decree can change their minds. Foreign powers watched France unravel. Britain and Austria mocked the chaos, but they missed the deeper shift. For the first time, a nation had tried to link sovereignty directly to money creation. The revolutionaries didn't just want freedom from monarchy. They wanted freedom from the old banking class. Before 1789, private lenders controlled credit. Now, the state tried to take that power for itself. It was a fight over who gets to create value: the crown, the market, or the people. This idea reshaped modern economics. The assignats were early fiat currency, money backed by belief, not bullion. Every central bank today echoes that experiment. When the U.S. Federal Reserve prints dollars, or when Europe expands balance sheets, they're doing a version of what France did in 1790. The difference is control. France printed blindly without credible restraint. Modern systems try to balance liquidity and confidence, but the danger remains. Once paper money detaches from limits, discipline fades. Let's pause on a key insight. Revolutions promise justice, but often deliver economic experiments. The French learned the hard way that moral legitimacy doesn't guarantee fiscal stability. They replaced one elite with another, bureaucrats instead of nobles, committees instead of kings, but the debt machine rolled on. The wars that followed devoured everything. By 1794, the printing presses never stopped. The government printed over 45 billion livres in assignats. Inflation soared past 13,000%. A loaf of bread cost more than a day's wage. Coins disappeared. People bartered again, a regression to survival economies. Soldiers demanded payment in metal. Merchants hid gold. The dream of paper prosperity collapsed. When money fails, violence follows. As assignats became worthless, trust eroded not only in the currency but in the revolution itself. Political factions blamed each other. The Girondins accused the Jacobins of corruption. The Jacobins accused merchants of hoarding. The Committee of Public Safety resorted to terror. Executions soared. Fiscal collapse fueled paranoia, and paranoia justified bloodshed. There's a hard truth here. Monetary failure is never neutral. It reshapes power. Whoever controls money controls survival. In France, this control shifted from monarchs to revolutionary committees to generals. Each promised order, but each needed funds. The chaos set the stage for Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon understood what the revolutionaries ignored. Power needs stable credit. In 1800, he founded the Bank of France. It was part private, part state, a hybrid model meant to restore trust. The lesson was clear. Ideals without solvency fail. Revolutions without currency control collapse into tyranny or dependency. Now, connect this to modern times. When central banks flood economies with liquidity during crises, they're repeating parts of France's playbook. They say it's temporary. They say it's controlled. So did the National Assembly. Every currency collapse starts with good intentions, saving jobs, feeding the poor, funding security. But every printing cycle tests one question. How much trust does your paper hold? In France, trust ran out before gold did. Once the paper fell below the value of the ink it was printed with, people stopped believing. That moment, when faith dies, is when revolutions devour themselves. The French case also shattered an old myth, that wealth equals stability. France was rich in land, art, and people, but poor in discipline. It spent like an empire and borrowed like a gambler. No resource can survive endless extraction. The hidden economics of the revolution were not abstract. They were visible in markets, wages, and breadlines. They turned philosophy into hunger. And they showed that no ideology, royal or republican, can outrun bad math. In the next section, we'll explore how this financial chaos transformed global thinking about money. Because out of France, as collapse, came a warning. Every political revolution creates an economic one too. And those shifts don't end when the guns go silent. France's economic collapse didn't stay within its borders. What happened between 1789 and 1799 reshaped global finance. For the first time, investors saw how political revolutions could destroy entire currencies. The assignat disaster showed lenders what happens when governments use printing presses instead of fiscal reform. Trust, once broken, doesn't return easily. After the revolution, foreign investors treated new republics with suspicion. When Latin American countries sought loans decades later, bankers in London demanded higher interest. They remembered France. The risk wasn't armies, it was ideology. If a government could erase property or devalue paper overnight, contracts meant nothing. The French Revolution introduced a permanent tension between democracy and debt. Popular will wanted spending. Financial stability demanded restraint. The two rarely align. Inside France, the legacy was mixed. The monarchy's collapse freed citizens from feudal dues and noble privileges, but inflation wiped out small savers. Farmers who sold crops for paper lost everything when prices fell back after stabilization. Merchants who guessed right on timing became rich overnight. Economic volatility replaced royal hierarchy. Instead of birth deciding wealth, now luck and timing did. This instability hardened a new attitude toward money. Distrust. The French learned to value metal over paper. Coins became symbols of certainty. When Napoleon rose to power, he restored the franc, tied partly to silver and gold. The new regime promised order, predictability, and balanced budgets. For ordinary people, that sounded like peace. After 10 years of chaos, stability was the real revolution. But the ideas born from collapse spread further. The notion that money was a political tool took root across Europe. Central banks, once rare, multiplied. Governments realized they needed institutions to manage credit independent of politics, or at least appear so. The Bank of England, already a century old, gained new prestige. The Bank of France, created by Napoleon, became the model for modern hybrids, public authority with private backing. These institutions tried to fix a fundamental problem exposed by France's fall. You cannot run a state on passion alone. Liberty, equality, fraternity, those ideals inspired millions, but they didn't pay for grain or war. The revolution taught a cruel but lasting lesson. Economic order is the skeleton beneath political flesh. Break it, and everything else collapses. Let's zoom out. Why does this matter today? Because every modern nation faces the same temptations. When crises hit, recessions, wars, pandemics, printing money looks easy. Politicians promise stimulus, debt forgiveness, and social relief. But behind every promise lies the same arithmetic that doomed France. If output doesn't match spending, paper fills the gap, and paper without trust turns to dust. Look at Argentina's peso, Zimbabwe's dollar, or Venezuela's bolivar. Each followed the French pattern: deficit, debasement, and collapse. Every time, leaders claimed their case was unique. Every time, reality proved otherwise. Economics doesn't care about ideology, it only measures balance. Now, let's trace the hidden ripple from 1789 to today's financial systems. Modern monetary policy, central banks, inflation targets, bond markets, all emerged as responses to crises like France's. The idea of separating money creation from political control came from observing what happens when populism runs the press. Economists like David Ricardo and later John Maynard Keynes studied these failures. They understood that currency is not wealth. It's a claim on it. When claims exceed supply, collapse follows. The revolution also reshaped taxation. Before 1789, taxes were privileges negotiated by estates. Afterward, they became universal obligations. This shift created the modern fiscal state, one that taxes everyone but promises representation in return. No taxation without representation wasn't just an American slogan. It became a French necessity. Once citizens overthrew a king, they had to fund their own government. Equality required contribution, but equality in taxation didn't solve inequality in outcome. The chaos enriched a new bourgeoisie, bankers, traders, and speculators who mastered paper markets. The same class that rose in the Revolution became the financial elite of the 19th century. In a cruel twist, the system meant to end privilege created a new one, based not on blood, but on balance sheets. The lesson is simple. Revolutions shift who holds the pen, not whether it writes in red ink. Every new order inherits old debts, literal or moral. France's republic began as a fiscal rescue mission. It ended as an empire under Napoleon, funded by conquest rather than reform. He paid soldiers with loot from abroad because domestic credit was gone. When war became the economy, peace became impossible. Today, nations avoid that path by issuing bonds instead of sending armies. But the principle is the same: promises against future income. Every treasury bill, every deficit budget is a descendant of those assonets. The form changed, the dependence didn't. Think about your own country. When leaders debate deficits or stimulus, they're reenacting versions of 1789. How much spending is sustainable? When does borrowing become bondage? The French Revolution answered with blood, but the question remains unsolved. There's another layer most overlook. The revolution didn't just expose economic fragility, it transformed how people thought about value itself. Before, money was objective. Gold, silver, something you could weigh. After the assignats, value became subjective. Trust in the issuer, belief in stability. That shift made capitalism possible. Stock markets, corporate bonds, and credit systems all rely on this same leap of faith. Without France's failure, modern finance might not exist in its current form. The pain created the precedent. If a state can redefine money, so can a market. In that sense, every investor today owes a debt to 1790. Let's close on perspective. The French Revolution is often told as a battle between classes or ideals, but underneath, it was a balance sheet implosion. Numbers triggered mobs, inflation turned reform into terror, and the attempt to print prosperity built a new kind of poverty, one measured in lost faith. Next time you hear about inflation or deficit spending, remember Paris in 1793. Remember the breadlines, the worthless notes, the promises that couldn't buy food. Remember how quickly freedom turns fragile when numbers stop adding up. If you learned something new, let me know where you're watching from. And tell me, do you think modern economies are smarter than revolutionary France? Or are we repeating the same mistake with better printers? Your comment shapes the next story. Thanks for staying to the end. If you're interested